So here we're going to start talking about radical oxygen species and toxicity associated with oxygen. So in general, if you think about radicals, oxygen radicals, you should always think of them as being toxic, even though they are made naturally during cellular processes. Toxicity is going to be a balance between the formation of radicals and the defense against radicals, including antioxidants as well as specific enzymes. So we're going to learn how oxygen is going to form these radical oxygen species, um, and then in future lectures what the body or the cells do to protect itself. So what is reactive oxygen species? These are highly reactive chemicals that are formed from oxygen. They can be peroxides, superoxides, hydroxy radical as described here. There are also radical nitrogen species, which we'll talk in a future lecture. You can also have a singlet oxygen and an alpha oxygen that could form. They're going to be generated primarily during mitochondrial oxidation, but they can also be generated in different organelles that have a high use of oxygen, such as the endoplasmic reticulum and peroxisomes. Now, just in general, some terms. So we have oxidation, which we know is a gain of oxygen, or it can also be a loss of hydrogen or a loss of electrons. Whereas the reduction is the opposite. It's the loss of oxygen or a gain of hydrogen or a gain of electrons. So in essence, an oxidant will oxidize other chemicals by taking electrons in the form also of hydrogen or by adding an oxygen. And then the reductant will reduce chemicals by supplying electrons or hydrogen or by removing an oxygen. There are many diseases that are now being associated with radical injury. And again, remember, radicals are made naturally in the body during cellular processes, and it's really an overwhelming of the defenses to neutralize these radical species that could lead to diseases. Now, oxidative stress is going to be the imbalance, which is you're having more reactive oxygen species or oxidants generated than the cell can deal with. And these can occur through many reasons. You can have an infection. Your immune system generates a lot of potential reactive oxygen species in the process of trying to control an infection, for example. And so we have a list of diseases here. We have diabetes, which is going to be associated often with Oxphos disease, which is a mitochondria DNA disorder. You can have Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, Duchenne type muscular dystrophy, which is a neurodegenerative disorder, etc. So there are many that are becoming more and more related to free radicals as part of the disease process. So again, oxygen has this property of being able to form a radical. And a radical for oxygen is an unpaired electron. These radicals are going to be formed because oxygen, remember, loves electrons. It's the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. So anytime you have electrons moving in a process, whether it's using NADPH through xenobiotic neutralization, or whether you're moving your electrons in the electron transport chain to form ATP, if oxygen gets access to those electrons, it's going to form a radical. So here we have an oxygen that is forming a superoxide ion and is gaining an electron to do this. Now, the superoxide ion can gain another electron and form hydrogen peroxide. And then hydrogen peroxide can get another electron to form water and a hydroxyl radical. And then eventually you can form water. And there are enzymes that push this process forward in order to neutralize the radicals. So what's important to understand is the radicals are independent. So they have an independent existence, meaning they can react with whatever they want to. They can react with lipids, they can react with proteins, nucleic acids. And these radicals are going to take electrons from other molecules. So they're going to leave behind in other molecules another form of a radical, which will then react as well. Our oxygen is going to like to pick up electrons from our electron transport chain from coenzyme Q, for example. And our hydroxide radical is going to be our most potent. that can be formed naturally in the body. It's important to point out that hydrogen peroxide is not referred to as an oxygen radical. It is a reactive oxygen species, but it does not have that radical nature, does not have an unpaired electron. Now, the reactive oxygen species, again, can be formed naturally, and this occurs in the electron transport chain. So here we have our electron transport chain, and we're showing our enzymes 1, 3, and 4. And we also have coenzyme Q, or quinolone, in our membrane, which will carry electrons between 1 and 3, for example. And so if in the process of moving electrons from 1 to 3, oxygen is able to grab an electron from our quinolone, then it'll become a radical. And this radical can become our hydroxide radical, which is the most potent, or it can be neutralized by enzymes, and such an enzyme would be superoxide dismutase. And this is found in our mitochondria and also in our cytosol. And this can convert our oxygen radical to a reactive oxygen species, but not a radical hydrogen peroxide. And then hydrogen peroxide can be dealt with and converted to water. Now, there are some reactive oxygen species that are made deliberately, and this is by the immune system. So the immune system has an inducible nitric oxide synthase 2, and it's going to form different radical oxygen species. And so we're going to form, again, our radical oxygen, and then this is going to form either our hydrogen peroxide, or it's going to form a radical nitrogen oxygen species, which can damage lipids, proteins, and DNA of our microbes. So this is a list of our reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen oxygen species. So again, we have that superoxide anion, which is common, and it's going to grab an oxygen during normal metabolic processes. And this can be a stepping stone for making more reactive oxygen species. So the other thing to note is that reactions involving this radical and other radicals occur in chain reactions. So often the lipid membrane is going to be a target of our superoxide anions, and it's going to create a radical within the lipid membrane, which will then go on to create a peroxide or a peroxy radical, and then this will cause sort of just a continuance of a domino effect until that lipid is eventually damaged, and which can damage the integrity of the actual membrane. There's a hydrogen peroxide, which is not a free radical again, but this can, if it's not neutralized quickly, can generate free radicals through the Fenton reactions through iron. We have the most potent hydroxyl radical, and this can attack biological membranes, can attack proteins, nucleic acids. We have other organic radicals, which has some R species. And we also have peroxy radicals. Peroxy radicals are common in the membrane, which we'll discuss in a future lecture. Hyperchlorous acid is produced by your immune system by neutrophils during what's called the respiratory burst. And this is to kill invading bacteria, but it can also attack our own cells. We have a singlet oxygen, and this is where you have an oxygen with one of the electrons has moved to a different orbital, and it has an anti-parallel spin associated with this. And this is going to be rapidly decayed, so it's not thought to be a very significant source inside the body. And then we have nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, again, is going to be a normal product that we make. However, it can form free radicals. It can bind to metals and then produce the reactive nitrogen oxygen species. So there are different types of reactive oxygen species. And those are shown here. And again, it just lists the different types of radicals versus non-radicals. So remember, radicals have an electron, unpaired electron, whereas non-radicals do not, but they are still reactive oxygen species. And then we have reactive nitrogen species, which have radicals and non-radicals as well. And so this is just a comprehensive list of the different types of species that can form in the body naturally. The hydroxide radical, again, is the most potent, and these are going to be formed through two non-enzymatic reactions that we've already discussed in prior lectures, the Haber-Weiss reaction and the Fenton reaction. And so in the Haber-Weiss reaction, you have a superoxide ion and a hydrogen peroxide, and then this can form the hydroxyl radical as well as water and oxygen. And then in the Fenton reaction with iron present, you have the hydrogen peroxide, and then you're going to generate the hydroxyl radical as well as your ferric form of iron. Now these reactive species have pretty short half-lives. You have your hydroxyl radical, which is the most important, which is only stable for about a nanosecond. Your superoxide anion, again, a microsecond, so if it can't find something to bind to before it's degraded, your cell will be able to control that. Peroxynitrite is going to be a millisecond. Our peroxyl radicals, nitric oxide, are going to be seconds. Hydrogen peroxide is going to be minutes. So in general, radical oxygens are bad for the cells, but the cells do have mechanisms to control them and to eliminate them. They can cause damage, and they do this by extracting electrons from biologic molecules, and this can damage those molecules irreversibly. The reactive oxygen species are going to be our superoxide, hydrogen peroxide, and hydroxy radicals primarily, and they are going to target many things. The cell membrane is one of the major targets, but it can also target nucleic acids and proteins. We also have nitrogen species, chloride species that can cause damage to cells as well. And reactive nitrogen oxygen species will form, again, natural process of generating nitric oxide.